winter. At Hogwarts, that was a word capable of dividing opinions with the same ease as a Quidditch match. For some, it was impossible not to break into a broad smile when they found, in the morning, the grounds covered by a white and shining mantle. For others, however, it was equally impossible not to let out a suffering sigh while rubbing their own arms, trying to recover a warmth that seemed to escape merely at the icy sight. But regardless of what the students thought, the snow outside was an excellent excuse for couples, of course. After all, there was no better excuse than winter to snuggle closer to one's beloved in front of the common room fireplaces. What remained for the love-struck, however, for the lonely souls who had won nothing more than shy smiles and fleeting glances, was the cold, which continued to be the only companion available. And that was what caused the knot in Harry's stomach that afternoon. Every step towards the library seemed to be a torture his heart inflicted upon itself. The sun was beginning to abandon the sky far too early, as it always did on those snowy days. Its golden light crossed every tall window, every gap between the columns, every corner the library allowed, leaving its last notes of warmth scattered over long tables and spines worn down by time. The shelves rose like towers of knowledge. Some books beat their covers like wings, floating lazily near the ceiling, while low whispers and the constant turning of pages filled the silence around him the instant the door closed behind him, leaving any interruption outside. Madame Pince stared at him from the entrance with her usual sour look, but Harry had already learnt, after so many years, that this was the look she used when she was in a good mood, or less bad-tempered than usual. Fortunately, the librarian only lowered her head and went back to reading something at her desk, paying no attention to his presence. Even so, Harry was sure she would remain perfectly capable of hearing him breathe too loudly. With a nervous sigh, he crossed the wide central aisle of the library, passing the long, almost empty tables. Guided by instinct, knowing exactly where to go. Two Slytherins seated at one of the tables shot him bitter, contemptuous looks, which, anywhere else, would certainly have been accompanied by muttered insults. Harry ignored them completely. His head was far too occupied with something much bigger, and after crossing a few sections, he finally saw her. There, in the corner, sitting at the table by the window that overlooked the Black Lake, was Hermione. The girl who always carried an answer when everything around him turned to confusion. His anchor in difficult moments, and his best friend. She had pinned her hair into a loose bun from which a few rebellious strands had already escaped, too stubborn to remain disciplined even during studying. She wore the grey jumper of her uniform and had left her cloak hanging over the back of the chair, taking advantage of the library's warmth to be a little more comfortable and loosening her red tie slightly. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly as she read quietly to herself, following the lines with the tip of her quill. Harry felt his heart tighten when he realized she had not yet noticed his presence. She was surrounded by rolled-up parchments and by a pile of books, and in one of them he managed to make out the title, The Rise and Fall of Dark Wizards. Because, beyond his own homework, of course she was doing what she could to help him, whether it was accompanying him on dangerous journeys, or, as in this case, studying. Hermione? The name escaped his lips almost timidly while Harry kept his hands shoved into the pockets of his cloak. Only then did she lift her head. The last rays of sun crossed the window and lit her brown eyes, turning them almost golden, like honey. Hermione smiled. That same small smile as always, but enough to make Harry's heart give a ridiculous leap inside his chest. "Harry," she said, "is training over already? Do you want to study a bit?" He cleared his throat and ran a hand through his hair, messing it up even more, if that were possible. "No, actually, I only came to ask you something." Hermione noticed the tension in his behavior. She lowered the quill onto the table and straightened slightly in her chair. "What happened?" she asked, with that careful subtlety of someone who already knew there was something wrong. "Do you—" Harry began, trying to sound casual and failing in a rather obvious way. "Do you want to go to Hogsmeade tomorrow?" Hermione frowned as though the answer were obvious. "Of course I do," she said. "Why are you asking? Isn't Ron going?" To her surprise, Harry shook his head. "No, he said he doesn't want to go this time." Hermione was left without a reaction for an instant. It was the first time she had heard that Ron, of all people, was not in the mood to go to Hogsmeade. "And why doesn't he want to go?" she asked, without taking her eyes off Harry, while she tried to clean a dry ink stain from her fingers. Harry's cheeks turned red, and if it could not get worse, 3 floating books hovered above them, as though they were curious beings who wanted to listen to the conversation. He looked away from her curious and dangerously attentive gaze. "I think he got tired from training today and wants to sleep in a bit later," Harry replied, evasive. Hermione bit her lip and rested her forefinger on her open book on the table. She knew when Harry was hiding something, and, much as her mind screamed at her to wrench the whole truth out of him right there, her heart began to beat faster before the silent question forming between the two of them. "So it'll be—" She hesitated, hating her own hesitation a little. "Just the 2 of us this time?" Harry nodded quickly, looking back at her with a little more firmness. "Yeah, that's why I came to ask if you wanted to go with me." "Of course I do." That answer came out far too quickly. Harry raised his eyebrows slightly, but did not say anything at once. The silence that followed was short, but terribly revealing. Hermione felt her face heat at an absurd speed. "I mean, I wouldn't let you go alone, obviously," she hurried on, her voice tenser than she would have liked. "Right. Just the 2 of us then," Harry replied, adjusting his glasses. "Anyway, I won't get in the way of your studying. Well, I'll see you later." Before Hermione could answer, he turned and disappeared between the shelves. And she remained exactly where she was, as still as possible. With the quill resting on the table, the book open before her, and no chance whatsoever of remembering which sentence she had been reading. Out of pure disinterest, the floating books beat their covers and drifted away again, leaving her completely alone. Hermione could not stop her mind from spinning in an agonizingly illogical way, and her stomach seemed to have been invaded by an entire swarm of butterflies. The next day, all the students were eager for the trip to Hogsmeade, as always happened. Several carriages were lined up with the Thestrals swishing their tails from side to side when Harry and Hermione left the castle together. They were wearing their heavy winter clothes with thick coats and their scarves. Harry with his pair of red gloves, and Hermione with her purple woolly hat and matching gloves. And although the path to the carriages was completely clear, thanks to the good work of Hagrid and Filch, the previous night's snowstorm had, fortunately, ended during the early hours. However, it had left a thick carpet of snow wherever they looked. And I said, trying to defend 2 bludgers at the same time wasn't going to work, but Ron was the one who insisted. And did he manage to defend them? Hermione asked, amused. Saves with the face are still saves. So yes, Harry agreed with full seriousness. That beautiful laugh she let out, combined with her cheeks flushed from the cold, was such a contagious sight that Harry laughed on reflex too, pleased with himself for having managed to draw that from her. A short while later, everyone who was going to the village was already gathered and getting into the carriages. Harry held the door open so Hermione could go in first, and she thanked him with a smile for the chivalry. But when Harry was about to get in, with his hand still on the carriage door, he decided to look back towards the castle entrance. It was an instinctive gesture, but one he could not avoid. And he let out an amused hoof through his nose when he saw Ron at the entrance, with a great freckled smile and his chest puffed out, almost proud. Harry managed to rid his lips while he clearly said, "Try not to mess everything up," while giving him a cheeky wink before disappearing back inside. "Harry?" Hermione's voice called him from inside, noticing that he was taking too long to get in. He closed the door. "I thought someone had called me," he replied, without going into details. Later, when everyone was already in Hogsmeade, the village's peaceful energy, as was customary on Hogwarts trips, had transformed almost in the same instant. The loud conversations, laughter, and young people willing to open their purses full of sickles and galleons brought broad smiles to any shopkeeper in their right mind, and the inhabitants soon became happy to see all that bustle. But despite the students' good sense in prioritizing their sweet supplies and securing a butterbeer during a conversation that had been decided back in the carriage, Hermione seized the chance and tugged Harry by the arm so they could slip away quickly from the crowd heading towards Honeydukes and the Three Broomsticks, taking a rather unusual route instead. I know you wanted to go to the Three Broomsticks," Hermione commented, visibly apprehensive, "but the editions this time are limited. If I don't reserve my copy, I won't be able to read it until next month." Harry shook his head, his green eyes reassuring her. "Don't worry. You don't need to justify yourself," he said calmly. Hermione's tense shoulders relaxed. "In that case, I'm not justifying myself." She lifted her chin slightly in false challenge. "I am merely informing you what we are going to do." Harry could not help laughing. "Yes, ma'am," he said, lightly bumping his shoulder against hers. Hermione felt a shiver take over her body at the silly touch, but did not let it show as they entered the tomes and scrolls. When they were younger, sometimes Harry and Ron used to count the time they spent inside the shop, restless, while Hermione wandered between the shelves, always with the same desire to buy every book that could possibly exist inside. But now, they weren't quite that idiotic anymore. Or, at least, that's what Harry thought. Because after living with Hermione all these years, Harry cherished every second watching how her brown eyes sparkled between the pages of the books she opened to flip through. He tried to share in that excitement, staying beside her, asking questions and showing interest in what she said or showed. Not because the subject was interesting, honestly Harry sometimes didn't understand a word, but because it was Hermione talking about it. And it was while she was explaining something about ancient Norse runes to him that the loyal customer status at Tomes and Scrolls paid off once again. When Thomas Brown, the shop owner, appeared behind the counter. "Ah, I knew you'd stop by, Miss Granger," remarked the old wizard with the white mustache. "I've even made your reservation in advance. Here's your copy." After they left the shop with the book Hermione had wanted so much, and whose name Harry no longer remembered, but knew it was something about arithmancy, they decided to wander through the village, their steps slow, making idle conversation. They talked about the new toys at Zonko's joke shop, which the twins, if they were still studying, would have loved to test in some prank on Filch, and about how Honeydukes was still simply packed. Better leave buying the sweets for later, Harry commented, putting his hands in his pockets. Why? Hermione asked. There are, too many Slytherins. You only don't like it because there are too many people, not because there are too many Slytherins. Harry let out a light laugh. Of course she knew him better than he knew himself, that he had to admit. Okay, you're right, but only because I'd rather have just you around. He only noticed what he had said, in the way he had said it, when he looked at Hermione again and saw the extreme blush on her face and felt his heart speed up. I mean, Harry cleared his throat, also feeling his own face heat. I think it's better to have a butterbeer first. Don't you agree? Of course, Hermione replied quickly with a nervous smile. A strange silence remained between them, but it was quickly broken as soon as they entered the Three Broomsticks. And after being served by Madame Rosmerta, there they stayed for who knew how long, enjoying the warmth of a fireplace near their table. At one point, the two of them ended up ordering a portion of chips with creamy cheddar and crispy bacon. Noticing the lack of salt, they reached out at the same time to take the salt cellar. Their fingers touched, and Hermione pulled her hand back far too quickly, as though she had touched hot iron. Harry pretended not to notice, although he spent the next few minutes holding his tankard with far more attention than necessary. It was only when Rosmerta lit the lanterns with her wand to brighten the pub that they both realized the sun had already set outside. Harry invited Hermione to take one last walk before McGonagall did the roll call for everyone to return to the castle. And even at night, the village was well lit, the lights from the shops reflected on the snow, making the ground shine in golden and orange tones. Now, with everyone's spirits more tired after a whole day of wandering through shops and buying things, the silence in the village was more palpable. They were walking side by side again, but this time close enough that their arms brushed now and then. Neither of them moved away when it happened. Harry was focused on listening to the sounds of their footsteps in the snow when he heard his name. Harry. He turned his face to her. Hermione kept her eyes on the road ahead, but Harry noticed the way she clutched the new book in her hands. Ron really was tired because of training, she asked directly. Hermione finally looked at him, raising an inquisitive eyebrow. It was impressive how she could turn such a small gesture into a complete interrogation. More or less, he replied. She just stared at him, unsatisfied with the answer. All right, he admitted with a sigh. Ron, he wasn't tired. At least not that much. Hermione stopped walking. Harry took 2 more steps before realizing and turned to her. The lights of a nearby shop illuminated part of her face. Then, why didn't he come? Harry shoved his hands even deeper into his coat pockets. Because he thought it would be better if, it was just the 2 of us this time. Hermione was silent for an instant. And you agreed with him? She asked in a low voice, vulnerable, with an expectation she could not hide. Harry began, feeling his face heat despite the cold. I wanted it to be just the two of us, but he did not find the words to continue, and before he became tangled up, he fell silent. Her expression softened. So this, was a date? She clutched the book tighter, holding it at chest height, like a shield. Harry looked everywhere possible before managing to face her again. I don't know, I didn't want to assume anything you didn't want first. Hermione bit her lip, but could not stop a smile from appearing as she watched him. You could have simply told me, she said softly. But I barely managed to ask you, and I talk to you every day. Yeah, I noticed. Thank you for your understanding, Harry replied with an awkward laugh, scratching the back of his neck. She let out a low laugh, and that seemed to be enough to dissipate at once all the tension Harry had been carrying since he had entered the library the day before. You would have accepted? He asked. I mean, if I had said it was a date? Hermione merely kept her eyes on him, still with the book pressed against her chest. To Harry, that was an eternity, one that was enough for him to begin wondering whether he had asked the wrong question. Harry, she sighed his name. I accepted without you even needing to tell me. When he heard that answer, he did not even know what to say. If before Harry had felt butterflies in his stomach, now it seemed like a meeting of badly behaved Cornish pixies. So, you knew? He asked. I suspected. And you came anyway? Hermione raised her eyebrows slightly. Of course I came, because If before Harry had not finished his words, now it was Hermione who had not found the courage to continue. But he did not need to know what she had not managed to convey in words. He simply read the whole truth in her brown eyes. Harry could not avoid a small smile of relief and, to a large extent, happiness. Hermione also smiled, although her cheeks were now far too red for her to blame only the cold. Neither of them could have said who walked towards the other first, but they stopped halfway, the shop light illuminating them both. A few flakes were beginning to fall again, catching on Hermione's woolly hat and in the hair that fell over her shoulders. And Harry, once again, felt his heart speed up. And did you like it? He asked. Hermione tilted her head a little, waiting to be able to give the answer, one that did not need words. He drew a deep breath, gathering a courage that seemed much harder to find there than before any dangerous creature he had ever faced. Then Harry slowly lifted one of his hands and brushed a strand of her hair aside. His fingers remained there for an instant, close to Hermione's face, and to his eternal gratitude, she did not step back. Harry leaned in slowly, still waiting for her to say something, to make some logical observation about McGonagall's roll call or about the time they should return. But Hermione merely closed her eyes. And then their lips touched. The kiss was soft and hesitant at first, laden with all the uncertainty that neither of them had managed to put into words. But when Hermione held the front of his coat with one hand while still holding her book with the other, and moved a little closer, Harry finally stopped thinking. And if the cold, at any point, had bothered them, there, in that instant, it simply ceased to exist. Nothing else mattered. Only that moment lost in the night. Her soft lips, his warm taste. When they moved apart, Hermione remained close, her face still raised towards him. "Does that answer your question?" she murmured. Harry was panting along with her, the clouds of vapor leaving their mouths mingling. "I think I'm going to need another confirmation." Hermione rolled her eyes, but the smile she tried to hide betrayed her. Without taking her eyes off him, she cast a silent spell on her book that kept it floating beside her, so that she could pull him towards her again with both hands by the front of his coat and kiss him once more. While Professor McGonagall's voice rang out in the distance, calling the students to return to the carriages, Harry and Hermione didn't hear it. They focused only on each other's breathing, free to live the love that had always existed there.